everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining the Pelee Island research webinar. My name is Melina Damian, and I am Ontario Nature's Communications Coordinator. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land where I live and where Ontario Nature's head office is situated in Toronto is within the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe nations and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory was subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to be on this land, and we acknowledge our responsibility to care for the land and care for each other through our work in a respectful manner. Now, some housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar for those who are unable to attend or if you have any technical difficulties. You are in listen and view only mode, so others cannot see you or hear you. Zoom features are visible towards the bottom of your screen when you scroll your mouse over. To ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. And please only use the chat feature to ask the hosts or panelists for help with technical difficulties. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'll now pass it over to our Executive Director, Carolyn Schultz.
Sorry about that. Just unmuting myself and making myself visible on camera. I would like to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome to Ontario Nature's first webinar of 2021. I'm delighted that we're hosting this webinar about our Stone Road Alvar Nature Reserve and our work to restore its native Alvar habitat through a multi-year initiative. I'm sure many of you who've joined this webinar have had the opportunity to explore Pelee Island, but if any of you haven't, I'm hoping this webinar will whet your appetite to visit this oasis of biodiversity. Pelee Island lies about 14 kilometers southwest of the tip of Point Pelee in the middle of Lake Erie. So when the opportunity arises, I encourage you to take a trip. This project that our presenters will be speaking about this afternoon is designed not only to restore the Alvar habitat of this particular nature reserve, the Stone Road Alvar Nature Reserve, but also involves multi-year research on restoration to inform best management of similar Alvar habitat to sustain and enhance natural biodiversity. This ongoing work would not only involves monitoring of our own nature reserve, but also the monitoring of adjacent properties, which are owned by partner conservation organizations. You will be hearing presentations about the project from Ontario Nature staff and also from our wonderful research and conservation partners. I would now like to introduce Smera Sukumar and Emma Horrigan, who have been leading the project for Ontario Nature, and they will be leading the webinar and introducing our partners when they come up to speak. Emma is our Conservation Projects and Education Manager, and Smera is our Nature Reserves Manager. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Smera and Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, so, oh, sorry, that worked. Sorry about that. Yeah, so as Caroline said, we're really excited for this unique webinar that we'll be conducting today with a multitude of different partners and speakers with various backgrounds and expertise. So I'll be starting off Ontario Nature's presentation and then handing it off to Emma Horrigan. And then the following speakers that you see on your slide will take over and talk about their portions of the project. And we will leave all of the questions until the end. So as Melina said, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end of their presentations. If it's specifically for one researcher or one speaker, please be sure to indicate that within your question so that I can direct it appropriately as well. So yeah, I'll start off with introducing our speakers today. So there's Emma and myself, and Caroline introduced us from Ontario Nature. We have Ryan Wolf from the University of Toronto, Jill Crosswaith from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. We have Annegret Nicolai from University of Rennes, Mark Cadot from University of Toronto Scarborough, Scott Macgyver from University of Toronto Scarborough, and Jen Mccarter from Natural Resources Solutions. So as Caroline mentioned, we'll be talking about the prescribed burn project on Stone Road Alvar, as well as larger initiatives taking place across Pelee Island as well. So a little bit about Ontario Nature. I'm sure we have many members on the call today who are quite familiar with our work, and welcome to anyone who hasn't joined one of our webinars or attended one of our events in the past. Ontario Nature's mission is to protect wild species and wild spaces through conservation, education, and engagement. And we do this through a variety of different programs. But today we're specifically going to be talking about the Nature Reserves program, which I manage. So this program spans all over southern Ontario, from Pelee Island, where our Stone Road Alvar Nature Reserve is, all the way up to St. Joseph Island and Manitoulin Island, and east to Deep River and near Ottawa. A lot of these properties are open to the public, so if you're in the local area and it's safe with current restrictions to go, we highly encourage you to visit some of our properties. So today, as you can see, we'll be talking about Stone Road, which is our southernmost property and one of the most southern points in Ontario as well. Our Nature Reserves program aims to protect high biodiversity areas in ecologically sensitive habitats. And we have 26 properties and 3 conservation easements totaling just under 3,000 hectares. So now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Emma Horrigan.
Okay, thanks so much, Samara, and welcome to everyone. It's really exciting to be sharing some preliminary results from this project and talk about our efforts over the last 3 years. So Samara is giving you an overview of the Nature Reserves program. Zooming in more closely on our Stone Road Alvar Nature Reserve on Pelee Island. This property is located on the southeast corner of the island and is although Ontario Nature owns this particular property, it's situated within the larger Stone Road Alvar complex. The Ontario Nature property is 42 hectares in size, or 104 acres. And it is a really special place to visit if you have the opportunity. It is home to 44 provincially rare and 33 regionally rare plant species, and provides habitat for a number of other at-risk species, which includes snakes, plants, and invertebrates. So what is an alvar? I thought I would just briefly start with the definition so we're all on the same page. These are naturally open areas with either a thin soil profile or no soil at all. And they occur over limestone, dolostone, or marble bedrock, with trees absent, or at least where trees do occur, they aren't forming a continuous canopy. And what makes alvars what characterizes the distinct flora and fauna associations associated with these open areas is that they are adapted to extreme environmental conditions. The persistence of disturbances such as flooding, drought, and fire all characterize the unique communities associated with alvars, and the persistence of these disturbances prevents woody species from invading these open areas and is what continues to promote high species diversity. So we know that in terms of maintaining grassland alvar ecosystems, that fire is an important natural and necessary component of the ecology of these communities, particularly on Stone Road Alvar. and that maintaining this type of natural disturbance is needed in order to decrease the abundance of woody shrubs and increase the abundance of native Alvar species. And the photo in this slide is showing you the types of shrub encroachment that we're seeing on stone road Alvar, species such as prickly ash and staghorn sumac invading into these open areas. And so with this research project, we had a number of objectives. Very broadly, we wanted to implement a prescribed burn on stone road Alvar to determine the effectiveness of this stewardship action for maintaining key habitat for species at risk. And our focus with this broad objective was on conducting a prescribed burn in 2 grassland Alvars within the Ontario Nature property. And you can see those areas on the map shown on this slide, which are delineated in the green color. And this area totals approximately 9 hectares or 22 acres. One other thing that I just wanted to highlight with this map is the adjacent and surrounding conservation lands. So when we, in order for us to address the question of the impact of the burn on various species, we had our unburned or our control plots set up in these adjacent conservation lands owned by Nature Conservancy of Canada and Essex Region Conservation Authority in order for us to be able to compare to the Ontario Nature burn site. Next slide. So in addition to this, the broad objective, we also wanted to conduct monitoring both before and after the burn. And we are monitoring both rare and at-risk species and their habitats. Our monitoring efforts were very diverse and included plants, invertebrates, snakes, lichens, birds, small mammals, and gray fox. And the subsequent presentations in this webinar will highlight the preliminary findings associated with some of these monitoring efforts. And for folks who are wondering what a prescribed burn looks like on the ground, I wanted to share some photos of the prescribed burn, which took place on September 6th in 2019 on Stone Road. So this was a low intensity burn, and we worked together with Lands and Forest Consulting to complete the prescribed burn. Next slide. This just shows you what the burn looked like shortly after. And there are 2 things that I just wanted to highlight here in terms of the timing of the burn. So when we were considering timing, we arrived at the decision to do an early fall burn based on the wet conditions on the Alvar in the spring, which wouldn't have made it conducive for completing a burn. And then in early midsummer is a very active season for migratory songbirds, snakes, and a variety of other species. So we also shied away from completing a burn during those months as well, which left us with early fall in terms of timing. And so in total, we have 2 years of pre-burn monitoring data, 2018 and 2019, and then 1 year of post-burn data from 2020. And with that, I would just like to hand it over to Ryan Wolf, who's going to be talking about the monitoring efforts related to snakes.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Emma. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Wolf. As Emma just mentioned, I am a master's student at the University of Toronto in the Rawlinson Lab, and I had the privilege of being a part of this large prescribed burn project. I actually started as an employee at Ontario Nature before I continued into my role as a master's student. And I've been working in conjunction with Ontario Nature and NRSI particularly on monitoring the snake populations on Pelee Island in regards to the effects of the burn on those populations. So on this slide, before I move on, you can see the 5 species of snakes that still exist on Pelee Island, and 4 of them are actually, to some different degrees, are still reliant on grasslands and open canopy systems like alvars and savannas. And the prescribed burn is a tool, of course, that restores these habitats. So the snakes were a focus of this monitoring project. Okay, next slide. The goals and objectives of this part of the project were threefold. Of course, we wanted to monitor the response of all the snake species on Pelee Island to the burn. And then two other sub-objectives were looking at blue racers specifically, where we were determining the changes in habitat quality and availability by looking at thermal quality and vegetation structure. But vegetation structure analyses haven't been done yet, so I'm going to leave that one off of this webinar for now. So in order to collect data and monitor the snake species on Pelee Island, we set up a treatment site on the prescribed burn area and then a control site off of the burn area where we surveyed for the snakes in the springs and summers of 2018, 2019, and 2020. We recorded all the species we observed, as well as some information about each individual. And then for species at risk, we recorded some more in-depth information that was aimed at teasing out further results such as snake health at each of the sites. Before I get into the results in depth, I do want to mention that they are kept on a very broad general scale, and that's because we're working with sensitive species. So to protect the animals, I don't give any detailed information. So over the 3 years of monitoring, our results showed that there was a decrease in the number of snakes observed post-burn, so in the 2020 field season. And that's compared to the previous years of 2018 and 2019. However, we do have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, and that's because there's yearly variability that happens, and we can't account for that when only having 1 year of post-burn monitoring. Of course, it could have been effect of the burn itself. It could be due to this variability, but only future years of monitoring will determine this for us. And then also of note, we had a pretty large anthropogenic disturbance in 2020, which could have affected the number of snake observations as well. But despite all this, we did have a large fluctuation in the numbers of snakes that we saw in each of the years. But statistically speaking, there was no significant difference in the number of snakes observations per year per survey throughout each 2018, 2019, and 2020. So now we'll move on to the second objective, which is thermal quality for blue racer. And to measure the changes in thermal quality for the blue racer associated with the prescribed burn, I set up a copper snake models with thermometers inside of them. And basically they recorded environmental temperatures as a blue racer would experience them if they were that model. So I set these up in 3 different microhabitats across the control and treatment site. And I recorded the environmental temperatures for 1 year before the burn and then the year after the burn, 2020. What's not mentioned here is that I also had to use historic literature to determine the preferred body temperature of the blue racer. And that's because when measuring thermal quality, you take the difference of the preferred body temperature of the species and the environmental temperatures available to them. And basically, the closer the environmental temperatures are to the preferred body temperature, the higher the thermal quality of the habitat. So in general, the data collection went really well for this part of the project, but there were a few snake models that were placed out in the burn area that did not get affected by the burn itself because it was low intensity. So there might be future efforts to work with that. So moving on to the results for this, the results I've been able to get from the thermal model so far show that the control site actually had higher thermal quality in 2019 before the burn, and then in 2020 after the burn, it switched, and the treatment site, the burn area, had a higher thermal quality for blue racer, which is good. The increase in difference between the 2 years, between the 2 sites, though, is not statistically significant. We haven't determined that yet. There's more analyses that have to be run. But I've put on some graphs here to show you just an example of how it changed over the years. So this is the prescribed burn site. If we look at the graph on the bottom left, you can kind of see how the temperatures vary over the course of a day. And the black line is 2020, the gray line is 2019, and then those red dashed lines at the top are the preferred body temperature of the blue racer. And so you can see in 2019, it didn't often reach into the preferred temperature range of the snake, but the environmental temperatures reached into into that range in 2020 a fair amount more. Okay, and so now we'll move on to kind of an explanation, because monitoring of the snakes is kind of straightforward, but thermal quality isn't always as clear cut. And the reason we're looking at thermal quality specifically is it's one of the critical components that allows a snake to persist in a certain area, because they're ectotherms, they have to thermoregulate. And when environmental temperatures don't reach that preferred body temperature, they have to bask and spend time basking, like the individual in the tree on the left picture. And then, of course, if the temperature in the environment exceeds their preferred body temperature, they have to take shelter, like the snake hiding under the tree roots on the right. And the idea here is that the more time they have to spend thermoregulating, the less time they'll have to perform necessary activities like foraging and mating. And that's why thermal quality is an important thing to measure. So in summary, the low intensity burn did not significantly impact snake abundance, though the number of observations were much lower post-burn. And from preliminary analyses, the burn did not significantly increase the thermal quality of the habitat for blue racer, but it did increase to some degree, and we're still doing further analyses to tease out some more information on this. And our next steps for this project are to continue monitoring snakes across these sites to eliminate the randomness effect of variability and paint a better picture of snake response to the burn. And then to place thermal models out in areas only affected by the burn. And lastly, to quantify the changes in vegetation, run those analyses, and then assess the burn's effects on habitat availability for the snakes. Thank you, that's all.
Thanks, Ryan. So next up, we have Jen Mccarter from Natural Resources Solutions, Inc., who's also going to be talking about snakes as well. I'll pass it over to you, Jen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. Today, I would like to talk to you about this 3-year study that we've been working on, where we were assessing and creating blue racer habitat on Pelee Island. So the overarching goal for the project was to learn more about the habitat of the blue racer on Pelee Island in order to help conservation land managers like Ontario Nature maintain and also create suitable habitat for this endangered species. Next slide, please. So this project was carried out on conservation lands throughout the blue racers range on Pelee Island. Next slide, please. And over the 3 years, we've been working on a variety of different things for 5 different project objectives. So this has ranged from creating a habitat model to look at suitable where suitable habitat was located on throughout the range, looking at the use of artificial Hibernacula that have already been built, trying to characterize natural Hibernacula or overwintering sites, and then also looking at nesting site availability. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the creation and restoration of habitat. And Ryan previously mentioned the monitoring of snakes before and after Ontario Nature's prescribed burn that we collaborated on. So I'm going to focus today on the creation of nesting habitats and hibernation habitats. So first I'll talk about the creation of artificial nesting habitats. And I want to give you a little bit of background on where blue racers naturally nest on the landscape. So in order to properly incubate their eggs, they look for sites that are decomposing and in nice sunny areas. So this includes things like rotting logs, vegetation piles under tree roots, compost piles, vegetation piles, things like that. And again, it has to be in open sunny areas. So they're going to get those nice warm temperatures to properly incubate their eggs. Now in 2019, we did some randomized plots across the landscape, trying to look at how much of this habitat was available for blue racer. And we didn't find very much. There were lots of logs available, but not always in nice sunny habitats. And so our conclusion was that these sites are probably limiting for these species. Next slide, please. So then we started building these artificial nesting sites. So we've so far built 30 nesting sites across the blue racers range. We did 10 in 2019 and then another 20 last fall. And we located them all in open canopy areas where they're going to get lots of sunshine. So typically at the edge of a field forest or in forest clearings or in Alvar openings that are nice and sunny. And these structures are essentially a tube of page wire fencing held up with some rebar on either side, and then we fill it with organic material that's going to start to break down and create those nice warm temperatures for incubation. And we tested different mixtures of local straw, leaves, wood mulch, and sticks. And now we're monitoring these structures to see whether or not snakes are actually using them for nesting. So to monitor them, we basically go back in the late fall after any eggs would have hatched. So we're not going to disturb any nests. And then we carefully go through all the material and sort through looking for eggshell fragments, snake skins, any evidence that they might actually be nesting in this material. So it's quite a lot of fun. You can see Jess on the side up to her knees in straw. So we did monitor the 10 structures we built in 2019 last fall, and we haven't found any evidence of nesting yet, but we did find lots of animals using these structures for shelter. So we were quite surprised actually to find lots of salamanders using these structures, because as the material breaks down, it's quite moist and good conditions for salamanders. And we also found lots of snakes actually hiding in these structures as well so far. We've found some garter snakes like this little snake on the left, which is a melanistic garter, and lots of Decay's brown snakes like this little guy on the right. So we're going to continue monitoring these structures, and hopefully over the next couple of years, we'll start to see blue racers and other species laying their eggs in these structures. Okay, so now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our artificial hibernacular creation. And first I want to talk about why hibernation sites are so important for snakes and what they look like naturally. So we all know Canadian winters are very cold. As Ryan mentioned, snakes are ectotherms, so their body temperature relies on the environmental temperature. So they need somewhere safe and stable to hide to survive throughout the winter. So Hibernacula or overwintering sites have to stay above freezing. They have to have some moisture or humidity so that the snakes don't dehydrate, but they also can't flood completely or else the snakes might drown. So they need these specific conditions all in one place. Natural sites on Pili typically include cracks and fissures in the Alvar bedrock that lead down to underground cavities or caverns that have these stable conditions. And previous studies had found that there were really only a handful of sites on Pelee Island, and so it's thought that these sites are also limiting for snakes on Pili. So with that in mind, given how important they are and that they might be limiting for snakes, we teamed up with 8 Trees Inc. to start working together to look at how we could best build some artificial sites on Pili. So in 2018 and 2019, we monitored underground conditions in these sites where we were interested in building these structures. We monitored depth to frost, humidity underground, and also the water levels in the soil. And what we found was that perhaps not too surprisingly for Canada's southernmost point, the depth to frost line was fairly shallow. But what was a surprise was how high the water levels came throughout the winter. So we found that the soils just became saturated with water over the course of the winter, meaning that any holes that are in the ground just completely fill with water. So that presents a special challenge for us to create these sites, because we don't want the snakes to drown. So 8 Trees Inc. came up with some really cool solutions to get around this potential flooding situation. And we went back in the fall of 2020 and installed several Hibernacula. So we did 3 large Hibernacula for adult snakes, which is the picture on the left of one of them, and 9 smaller Hibernacula for smaller snakes or juvenile snakes. And all these were designed by 8 Trees in a really unique way to ensure that they were either self-contained, like the adult ones, just kind of they're built out of a cistern so that the water levels outside won't affect the snakes inside that cistern. or they were built into like a pre-existing soil mound to get those snakes above the surface of the soil so that the water levels won't come up and flood the Hibernacula. So our next step with this is to now monitor conditions inside these created Hibernacula and make sure that they're actually suitable for snakes. So again, we're looking at what temperature throughout the winter, humidity levels, and also the water levels within these artificial Hibernacula. And assuming that all the conditions look right, we'll open them up next fall and hope that, that snakes will actually start using them on the landscape. So that's all I had to talk about today. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks, Jen. Next, we have Annegret from University of Rennes. So Annegret, if you want to come on, we can have you spotlighted. Perfect.
Yes, hello everybody. So I'm Annegret Nicolai from the Biological Field Station in Paimpont of the University Rennes 1 in France. And I'm monitoring snails on Pelee Island already since several years. And for this study, I invited my colleague Sarah Guillochot, who is working on earthworms, so we could also study the impact of the prescribed burn on the invasive earthworms on Pelee Island. So next slide. Yes, in the Alvar ecosystem, we have a really shallow soil, and the dead leaves from the plants that fall on the ground, they form the topsoil. And in this topsoil, we can find a great variety of different species that are actually degrading the leaf litter and give nutrients back to the plants. And among these species, we have snails and earthworms. Next. So on the Stonewood Alvar, we have one endangered species that's called a broad-banded forest snail, and the species really relies on the leaf litter for food and also for shelter because it finds optimal temperature and also the optimal humidity that's needed. And our research question was if the fire will negatively impact the species on Stonewood Alvar. And then we have the earthworms, and they are mainly, the community of earthworms is mainly composed of invasive species from Europe, and they feed also on the leaf litter, and so they can destroy the snails' food resources and shelter. And our research question was if the fire could help to control these earthworms on Stonewood Alvar. So let's start with the broad-banded forest snail, the endangered snail species. It's also called Alogona profunda. It has brown bands on its shell. The shell is approximately 2.5 centimeters wide, so it's a relatively big snail. It has a large lip and a big hole underneath, and a pill body. It lives 4 to 6 years, and it needs 2 to 3 years to reach maturity. Its reproduction is in spring, and then in the summer you can observe it on the more and higher levels of the vegetation because it estivates, and then in the winter it hibernates in the soil and it closes its shell with a thin skin which is calcified. The Canadian range is not very big. Historically, we found the species around Oxley and Point Pili, Leamington, and also on the southwestern Lake Erie Islands. But currently, it's only present on Point Pili and on Pelee Island. And on Pelee Island, the distribution is a little bit special. It's closely linked to the former islands that you can see here on this old map. So we find the species on 3 of these former islands. So we have studied, or we have observed the species, next species, in the burn area on the Ontario nature property. And we found that this distribution is also quite patchy. So we have areas where we have a high density, more in the northern part, and then other parts where we have really low or medium density. And after the burn, with these first afterburn sampling that we had so far, we only found some individuals, so in the parts that were not burned, so that you see here in yellow, So there's the same density. And then in this part where we had a high density, we found only a few individuals, so the density was quite low. This means that the fire has reduced the snail abundance, but the fire didn't kill all the snails, so there are still some snails in this area present. Next. Now we will have a look at the earthworms. The earthworm community is composed of different functional groups. We have epigeic species that live mainly in the leaf litter. They don't burrow onto the soil and they feed on the leaf litter. Then we have endogeic species that you never see in the leaf litter. They only live on the soil and they feed on organic matter that's in the soil. And then we have strict anistic species that have deep vertical burrows. They come to the soil surface and they can pick up some leaf litter and bring it into their burrows and then feed on this leaf litter in the burrows. And sometimes you can observe the cast on the soil surface. And then we have a group that's a little bit in between these two, the epi-anistic. They live in the topsoil, but they have short vertical burrows and they also feed on the leaf litter. So in Stonewood Alvar, we sampled the earthworm community in different areas. In the burn area, so here in pink on the Ontario Nature property, and then also on other open alvars that served as control sites. So on the Urca property and NCC property, and then also some samples we took from forested parts. So the number of earthworms on the Ontario Nature property, so in the burn area, is quite low, because the soil is very shallow there, and compared to the forest where we have bigger number of earthworms because the soil is deeper. The other two properties, Urca and NCC, is quite similar to what we have on Ontario Nature. Now for the earthworm community composition, you can see on the graph below that we have on the open Alvar, so Ontario Nature, Urca and NCC, we have all different functional groups that are present. While in the forest, we have mostly endogeic species, so those that live in the soil, and then the epi-anistic that live in the topsoil. Now we have compared the number of earthworms before and after the burn. And in the Ontario Nature property, so where the burn happens, before the burn we had a higher number than after the burn. But we could also observe this exactly same pattern in the control areas. So for example, here on the NCC property. So this means that the burn had no real effect on the number of earthworms. Yes. If you have a look at the community composition, then you can see that the earthworms that feed on the leaf litter, so here in yellow and blue, they have disappeared after the burn on the Ontario Nature property. But in the Alvar control areas, these species are still present. So this means from these preliminary results, we can already see that the burn can eliminate litter feeding species. Next, please. So in conclusion, for our endangered species, we see that the fire has reduced the number of snails, but the question still remains if the species can easily recolonize the Alvar and how fast this will be. And for the invasive earthworms, we could see that the fire is able to eliminate litter-feeding species, but now it would be interesting to know how fast they can reestablish their community from adjacent areas. So this will be the research question for further studies. And I thank you for your attention, and I leave you with a little picture of snails on the Alvar, where you can check if you can easily spot them.
Thanks, Anna-Gret. We'll have to see what the answers are of how many snails.
Yes, how many snails you can see.
Thank you. So next we have Mark Cadot from the University of Toronto Scarborough, who's going to be talking about the plant diversity found on the Alvar.
Thank you so much, Samara. Thank you everyone for tuning in. So my part of this overall project was to look at the plant communities on the Alvar habitat, and I just need to acknowledge several people that have helped out over the past few years on this project. Next slide, please. As we're all aware, Alvars are an imperiled habitat type, not only in Canada, but through their full distribution. They're especially sensitive to the effects of invasive species, changes to nutrient dynamics and soil properties, changes inflicted by changing land use through agriculture, suppression of fire, as well as they're particularly sensitive to changes associated with climate change. And this has a number of consequences for their long-term persistence, their ability to be a habitat for a number of other species, as we've heard about already today, as well as their functioning. And so as part of this project, we really wanted to understand some of the basic components of diversity on these alvars and what structured them. So we looked at how soil properties determine plant community diversity and structure. We're also interested in how these soil properties influenced how these alvars responded to fire and how fire influenced those alvar communities. So what I mean by community structure is several things. First is just diversity, so the number of species, plant species that we find on Alvar. We're also looking at plant height and mass or biomass, so how much of the local resources are being converted into living tissue and how that might be reflected in those communities. And finally, we're looking at what we call economic traits. Can you hit the next, Sarah? So when I say economic traits, what I really mean is a continuum between two strategies that can really help us gain insights into these communities. One is a live fast, die young strategy, where plants that tend to be shorter have high nitrogen in their tissues, low carbon, so they're not investing much in structure and protection, and they tend to have large leaf area per unit mass ratios, compared to a slower growing and conservative strategy where plants tend to be taller, have low nitrogen in their tissues, high carbon, so they've really invested in structure and defense, and they tend to have small leaf area per mass. And you can see it in this figure here why I'm focusing on this this leaf area per mass. So it's the bottom axis, which we call SLA, a specific leaf area, correlates strongly with species growth rates. So species that tend to have large area of leaves relative to how much mass or how much they've invested in them tend to grow really quickly. So these tend to be the weedy species. Next slide. So what we did was we focused on several parts of the alvars, but here I'm showing you where we focus on the Ontario Nature property as well as across the road in the what would be the unburned area. We laid out transects with 6 plots on each of these transects. The plots you can see on the right here are just these small 1 by 1 meter square plots. Next slide. We also collected a number of traits on these individual plants in these plots, including height, leaf area and mass, carbon, and tissue nitrogen. We also looked at some of the species at risk, like blue ash and hop tree. I'm not going to say too much about those at this point. We also did a number of samplings to get understanding of the soil quality. So we looked at soil depth, organic matter, nitrogen, carbon, pH, and we also looked at the proportion of different particle sizes, whether the soil was sandy, silt, clay. So just a few highlights of what we've found. So what we found is that as soil depth increased on the Alvar, we saw a decline in species richness, a number of plant species. And so what that tells us is in shallow soils where conditions tend to be more stressful, there's more drying out, there's more flooding in the spring, there tends to be less competition, plants are stressed. And so we're able to maintain see higher diversity in these shallow soils. At the same time, those soils that tend to have low clay also harbored a larger number of species. Again, so if we're shifting to other soil types, there may be stressful conditions that are allowing greater diversity of species. Next slide. When we look at that live fast, die young spectrum. So we're looking at that specific leaf area. What we find is we tend to see more competitive species, so species with small specific leaf area occurring in deeper soils. So that confirms our thinking that the decline in species richness in deeper soils has to do with the takeover of more competitive, slower growing species. Also, we tend to see more of the live fast, die young strategy occurring on higher clay soil. So it seems to be these mix of strategies across different aspects of soil quality and depth. Next slide. So what we're still doing moving forward is we've already analyzed how the soil properties relate to variation in burn, because it was a low intensity burn and burn in some spots and not others. And there seems to be no correlation between soil properties and burn. And so what we're doing now is we're examining how the communities have changed, if they've changed post-burn. So we're doing a lot of the laboratory analyses right now on nitrogen and carbon in the soil and leaf tissues. And we're asking whether or not some species are more resilient to fire than others, how plants on shallow soils were affected by fire, because fire should be able to impact the full root system. So the roots are less protected in shallow soils. We're asking the basic question of how fire can promote diversity and whether there's a shift to the live fast strategies. Next slide. As I said, there are species at risk on this Alvar, including climbing rose, blue ash, and hop tree. And we've collected data assessing their survival, growth, and reproduction. And we're looking at potential impact of fire as well as shrub invasive species encroachment. But this part is still ongoing. And thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Samara.
Thanks, Mark. So next we have Scott Macgyver, who is going to be talking about bees on the Alvar.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks for hosting this session, and it's been a pleasure working with the team and with Ontario Nature. So we just heard a bit about plant communities and how they're impacted by fire, and many of the insects that depend on plants, including bees that visit them for pollen and nectar resources, will also be affected. And the types of bees that are affected will be dependent on their life history traits. So for example, how many different kinds of flowers they visit, whether they nest in the ground or above it, and so on. And so in this work that I hope to explain to you in the next several minutes is to look at not only assessing the types of bees that are found on Pelee Island, but how they are differently impacted by the prescribed burn intended to thwart these invasive species. Next slide. So important for us first in understanding the bee community on Pelee Island is to get a baseline survey of the types of species that exist there. Historically, there haven't been as many bee surveys. And in general, bees are very hard to identify and they're very diverse. And so it does take quite a bit of time to build up a collection of species from which you can start to infer process from pattern. So what we did first was, collect bees on different areas of the Stone Road Alvar, as seen here. A very straightforward and passive, unbiased way to sample bee communities is using this device you see on the left. It's called a vein trap. And this fluoresces colors that are attractive to all different kinds of bees. So we set them out for a very short period of time, less than a week in interval every few weeks. And we set out 6 across the property in the first 2 years pre-burn. But because these devices are destructive, to identify bee species, we often have to pin them, curate them, and compare them against other collected specimens. It can be quite destructive, and so we opted not to include this in a follow-up year post-burn because we had a really good collection in the first 2 years. Next slide. From this collection, we've been slowly working through the identifications. Next up will be depending on some DNA barcoding to confirm identifications. And this will form a reference collection for us at the University of Toronto Scarborough, which we are housing a collection of the wild bees of Ontario. And we'll also be providing a synoptic collection to Pelee Island, hopefully hosted at the museum space there. And so we'll be able to get species identities, their abundances, and then also identify some of those life history traits I mentioned for subsequent analysis. Next slide. One of the ways that we can assess the impacts of fire on bee communities is through identifying their unique interactions with the floral species they visit. We call these plant pollinator interactions. And this interaction network is a way in which we can assess the stability, the resiliency of these communities. And the way we did this, of course, when we use the vein track, we can't ascertain which flowers each of these bee species visit. So this is a bit more work, and we spend several hours each time we visit these properties, sweeping bees from flowers with hand nets. So we can identify the flower, we can identify the bee, and next slide. We also remove all of the pollen off of the bee's body. Of course, many of us have seen bees covered in branched hairs, coated in pollen. We have a method in the lab where we can remove those pollen grains from the bee, stain them, put them on a microscope slide, and then identify those pollen grain types to species using, again, a synoptic collection we've been building in our research lab at the University of Toronto Scarborough. So from this work, we get information relating the bee species identity to the flowers they visit. And that's what's represented in this diagram here, this network diagram where, take for example, on the left in green, we have bees, and on the right in orange, we have plants, flowers. And the lines that connect between indicate the finding of a bee visiting a certain flower. And by creating these network graphs, we can actually calculate a number of indices that allow us, again, to assess the connectivity of this network, the stability of this network at different sites in the Stone Road Alvar and pre and post burn. Next slide. Yep. So that is our third objective here, is to examine the change in wild bee plant interactions following a prescribed burn. And what we would expect is post or pre-burn, at a time where there's more invasive plant species that dominate these landscapes. We didn't expect that there would be certain bee species that are overrepresented because these resources support those dominant bee species, whereas more specialist relationships are underrepresented because these rare or flowers or plants that are more negatively impacted by invasive species encroachment are less represented. And so you can see on the left, there's the pre-graph where you have, again, larger sections of the interaction network represented by certain species. And what we anticipated post-burn is that when we repeat those surveys in the same landscapes, is that we would see a greater diversity in the interaction web, right? So more specialist species being represented, and that we also see greater turnover in the bee and flower community. So some species that weren't present in pre-fire would be present post-fire, again, because these floral resources are now available to them because the invasive species had been thwarted. Next slide. This is work that we're still, again, we're identifying many of these bee species, which is a monumental task. Some of these groups are very hard to work with. But as we do that, we're identifying, again, those life history traits of bees that we can determine from the literature. So again, whether they're cavity nesting bees, bees that nest in plant stems and logs above ground, versus those that nest below ground, digging into the soil underneath rocks, etc., as well as kleptoparasitic bees. So these are bees that actually have foregone visiting flowers for pollen and nectar, and instead raid and parasitize the nests of other bee species. And you can see from this middle graph here that we anticipate that after the burn, cavity nesting bees would be less represented because, of course, the vegetation has been incinerated in some locations, whereas the ground nesting bees would be overrepresented because they essentially are protected, having nested underground. As well, we'd often see kleptoparasitic bees increase in number, and I was actually just identifying some bees from Pili 2020 the other day, and we found some really neat steeless kleptoparasitic bees, a kind of a interesting rare group, which I won't go into right now. The last bit here is when we determine those life history traits, we can actually calculate indices that relate to that functional richness within the communities. And we expect that the functional richness will increase post-burn, again, to the reasons that I described earlier, that many bees will respond positively to fire. And it's because we would expect that many of these sensitive plant species, native plant species that have evolved with a fire regime will be also supported. Next slide. And so just an image of the nodding onion meadow landscape there, and some of the charismatic bee species that we find on Pelee Island. Osmia conjuncta is a snail shell nesting mason bee, one of our few species that do this particularly unique nesting strategy. So we saw from Anne Gret's slides, those fairly large size snail shells. Although we haven't found any bees in the snail shells yet, we do see high numbers of this particular bee here. For example, this bee is nowhere to be found in Toronto. And then the brown belted bumblebee, Bombus Grizzocolas, this is a bumblebee species that's very often mistaken for the rusty patch bumblebee, a species at risk and has been thought to be extirpated in Ontario. Next slide. So this is just a quick summary table of abundances across the different Stone Road Alvar regions by genus. Not a lot to really explain here, other than there's a lot of the expected genera present on the island. Still lots more work to be done on 2019 and 2020 samples. We do see slightly less richness and abundance on the Ontario nitrous site versus the other two regions we surveyed, but I mean, this is not statistically tested just quite yet. Next slide. And so again, from the vein traps and the hand-netted specimens, we had a number of species from 2018 and 2019 that we're working through. Again, Osmia conjuncta and Bombus Grizzocolas well represented. Another bee species that's quite abundant on the island is Melissodes bimaculata. This is a long-horned bee that's jet black with a white tip at the end of the abdomen. It's really, really obvious bee to find. And we have many pollen loads collected from bees that we've netted, over 600 specimens. So great fodder for undergraduate and graduate students, and inevitably a lot of great information on the kind of unique life history and pollination system that we find on the Stone Road Alvar. Next slide. Very important to point out as well is, of course, Pelee Island is home to a number of residents. And for the first time in 2020, we found on Pelee Island, in the Stone Road Alvar, the presence of honeybees. In fact, 26 individuals were collected by our students. It's important to note that honeybees, Apis mellifera, the bee that we keep for honey and as a hobby, is non-native. And recent studies have shown that it's out competing wild bees for resources. So again, the floral assemblages that are present on the island. As well, they're known to transmit pathogens, particularly on flowers, to other bees, including wild bees like bumblebees. So we have to be quite cognizant of some of the activities that we carry out on the island and how that may spill over into some of these rare habitats. Next slide. And that's it. So there's still lots to do. We've moved quite far in terms of databasing and curating all of our specimens, but identification does take some time. We're moving forward with DNA barcoding on some of the more tricky ones, and we'll be working with the Cadot Lab moving forward to try to find ways to link the plant and bee community data together to find some more interesting results. So thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Scott. I think the snail shell nesting bee is always a surprising one to hear about. So yeah, thanks. And I see lots of questions coming in, so we'll get to them all at the end. We just have one more presentation to go. I'll invite Jill Crosswaith from Nature Conservancy of Canada to come up to speak a little bit about their work and our partnership on the island.
Thanks, Mara. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Crosswaite. I'm the Coordinator of Conservation Biology for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I've been with NCC for about 10 years working on Pelee Island. And what I'd like to do with my presentation is to give a little bit of the conservation context on Pelee and how this project fits into that. So next slide. So just a little bit of background on what the Nature Conservancy of Canada is. We are a nonprofit charitable organization that is a land trust. So we acquire and manage land for conservation. We've been around for about 60 years and we've helped secure about 14 million hectares. And we really like to focus in on areas that have high natural diversity that are high priorities for conservation. Pelee Island being one of those areas. Next slide. So Pili is really unique. It's cool. It's in the middle of Lake Erie. It's got this mild climate. It's got really high diversity, a lot of rare species, and unique in Southern Ontario. It's got a really large proportion, relatively speaking, of protected lands. So about 18%, which includes about 60% of the natural habitat on the island, which is really unique for Carolinian Canada, because generally speaking, there's not much protected land, and it opens up some interesting opportunities as well for conservation. Next slide. So because of the unique climate, you get some really interesting habitats as well. So not only is the climate quite mild, the islands themselves have been isolated from the mainland for thousands of years. And you get some really unique habitats like Alvar that's been discussed, hackberry dominated forests, significant sand beaches. And also important to note is it's really important habitat for species that migrate, like birds and insects and potentially bats as well. And because there's all these rare habitats, you also get rare species. And that southern latitude really helps contribute to a lot of these species that are at the northern edge of their range. So about 220 species are tracked by the Natural Heritage Information Center as being rare. And that includes 12 species of global concern and 75 that are federally or provincially at risk, which is a really high concentration of rare species. Some of these are only found in Pelee Island in Canada, such as the blue racer and the gray fox. So as I was mentioning, that there's also quite a lot of conservation land on Pelee, so about 18% of the island is formally protected, and not just by one landowner. There's actually 4 conservation organizations that are managing conservation areas here. So that's the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Ontario Parks, Ontario Nature, and Essex Region Conservation Authority. Next slide. So this presents a really unique opportunity for species recovery. So because there's all these rare species and most of the large blocks of natural habitat are protected for conservation, some of those more typical threats to species diversity are actually already ameliorated. There's no risk of these areas being cleared for development. But it also puts a lot of the onus on conservation organizations to protect these species. And often we don't know very much about what they need. With 220 rare species, we don't know very much necessarily about the habitat needs of these species and how different management might impact them. So as I was saying, they may have conflicting needs. We've got a lot of rare species packed into these fairly small areas. The conservation area is about, in total on Pelee, is about 1,800 acres. So we really need to understand how they might respond to different management techniques and what kind of techniques are appropriate in what areas and how these species are going to react. So especially with 4 conservation organizations, the collaborative management of these areas is really key. We all need to be working together to make sure that we're doing the best that we can for these species to make sure that there's long-term survival. So specifically about Alvars, the Alvars are not all just at Stone Road Alvar, which is in the lower right-hand corner of the island. You can see there the pale areas shown on the map on the right are the Alvars. But they're actually spread across the island. And if you look at the map on the left, you can see that this is a historic map before the island was drained. So Pelee Island used to be a series of rocky outcrop islands in the middle of marsh. And that was drained in the late 1800s. So for over 100 years, that's been farmland essentially. And those rocky outcrops are where the Alvars exist today. So, and just to point out, some of those disturbances that would have taken place naturally while that area was open marsh might have been flooding and ice scour, potentially fire moving across the marsh, wave action, that kind of thing that would have helped to maintain some of these areas. So there's about 90 hectares in total of Alvar on the island, spread across, again, the 4 different conservation managers. And we all have kind of similar ongoing management challenges. In recent history, up to about the 70s, a lot of these areas were grazed by cattle, and that now that it's in conservation ownership and grazing is no longer an activity that occurs on the island, though that has now ceased as well. So there's no more disturbance happening in these areas. Next slide. So we have a lot of challenges being faced by these, the questions of what do we need to do? How do we manage them? What are the main issues? And this project is one of those first stepping stones. It's been really great working with Ontario Nature and Essex Region Conservation Authority and all of these researchers to start to look at some of try to answer some of these questions as to how we can manage these and how we can make sure that we're supporting all species. Oh, sorry, go back one. So just to point out, this is another Alvar. This is up towards the northern end of the island. And this is a place where we would like to take some of the results of this project and apply them because we have what you can see on the top right-hand side, there's a trail mown through the Alvar. You can see a lot of shrubby encroachment on either side of the mown trail. And then on the other side, there's a lot of European pasture grasses that have spread out and covered the rocky Alvar completely. You can actually just peel that off in some cases. And then when you do that, you actually get those rare Alvar species coming back. And we also have invasive shrubs coming in a lot of these areas that can be really problematic because they really increase the shade. They leaf out much earlier and drop their leaves much later than native shrubs. So they can really change the temperatures on these areas. And the grass may be helping to build up soil and create deeper soil conditions in areas that were formerly quite extreme in terms of soil depth. So there may be a lot of different factors here where invasive species that are coming in after disturbance or anthropogenic disturbance are now potentially mitigating some of those extreme conditions that you would see normally in a natural Alvar. Okay, next slide. So one thing that we have been doing around the Browns Road Alvar area is some restoration to create additional buffers around those Alvar areas. So what you can see on the left on that map is orange is non-natural habitat and green is natural habitat. And that kind of light pinky color is the Alvar. So we've been working to restore some agricultural fields that NCC owns around these Alvar areas to kind of protect them, give them a little bit of buffer and give native species some space to move between different natural habitats. The next slide. And one of these things that we've done on this field is some wetland creation by excavating low-lying depressions, as well as some areas where the soil is actually quite shallow. So this has created some actual Alvar habitat on a former farm field. And this is already being colonized by native Alvar species. And this really provides a unique opportunity of a blank slate rather than trying to work with existing areas with existing rare species. We can really start to look at how can we manage this and what do we need to do to make sure that this stays as good habitat for the relevant species and manage it into the future and put it on the right successional trajectory. So we're really excited to see how the results of this project continue on. And one of the big things that may come out of this is a standardized way of monitoring different disturbances. So we might look at invasive species removal or manual shrub removal or grazing, and we could apply the same methodology to look at how different species respond to those and compare to how they respond to fire to help us really hone in on what is the best management for all of these areas that hopefully we can then apply across the island. So thank you for listening, and I'll pass it back to Emma and Samara.
Okay, thanks, Jill. And just in wrapping up here, I just wanted to take the opportunity to recognize all the key partners that have been involved in supporting this project in various ways. So again, we've worked very closely with Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Essex Region Conservation Authority. Lands and Forests has been instrumental in executing the prescribed burn and providing us with guidance on approaches through that. We have also worked closely with engaging the Essex County Field Naturalist Club, and the Township of Pili has also been incredibly helpful and instrumental in terms of assisting with coordinating logistics on the ground. And the research partners, which have given presentations today, and of course, the list extends beyond just those listed in the slide, which will take me to the next slide, acknowledging all of the various research collaborators that have assisted with providing guidance on methodology throughout this project. Again, the prescribed burn crew, various field staff, and volunteers who have all assisted with data collection over the last 3 years. And then again, some individuals at the township who've assisted with road closures and getting the word out to island residents about our prescribed burn work. And of course, this project wouldn't be possible without our key funders. So I wanted to take the opportunity to recognize the Peacock Foundation, TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, the Species at Risk Stewardship Fund, so funding through the provincial government there, and the Habitat Stewardship Fund through Environment and Climate Change Canada for supporting this important work. And if you're interested in learning more about the project, I would encourage you to check out an article that was written for the winter 2019 issue in our Ontario Nature magazine. So you can find that through our website. We're also going to be continuing monitoring efforts on the island this coming field season in 2021. So if you keep an eye out on our events page, you can find out more about outreach and opportunities to come visit Stone Road Alvar in the coming year. We'll keep our fingers crossed that we can have some in-person events. And for more general information about the Nature Reserves program, I would also encourage you to visit the website. You can also reach out to us at the email address listed at the bottom of this slide, so reserves@ontarionature.org, if you have any specific questions beyond what we're able to address in today's webinar. And next slide. Yeah, so then now I'm going to hand it back to Samara, who's going to facilitate questions.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm going to invite all of the speakers to turn on their video, and then depending on whether a question comes your way, we can ask you to unmute yourselves as well. So thanks, everyone. I think we had a lot of questions come in, so clearly it was really engaging, and a lot of people do have some follow-up questions about the work that's happened over the last few years. So, sorry, I'm just looking through some of the questions now. There's a question for Ryan and Jen about blue racers. Do we know where the last population of blue racers lived on the Ontario mainland? Would it be possible to reintroduce a blue racer population to the mainland?
Yeah, Jen, do you want to go or do you want me to take it? I answered it in the chat, but.
Oh, you did answer it in the chat. Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay. Do you want me to go over it live now, or do you want me to just leave it in the chat?
Yeah, if you can just quickly go over it, that would be great for people to listen.
Sure. Okay, so on the mainland, the blue racer used to exist in a few different places, but most recently it was found up near Pinery Provincial Park. and I think that was in 1983. But since then, they have not been seen anywhere on the mainland, so they are considered extirpated from there and only remain on Pelee Island. As for the potential to reintroduce them to the mainland, it is possible, and it is in the government recovery strategy to do this once the population on Pelee Island has been stabilized. But the habitat where the blue racers used to exist on the mainland is no longer suitable. So before any sort of reintroduction would be feasible, there would have to be a large-scale habitat management effort done before that could actually be looked at.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And a super quick question for Ryan while I have you unmuted. There were a few questions about what the 5 species of snakes found on Pelee Island were, and I know Jen mentioned a couple of them, but if you could just go over that as well.
Yes, sure. So the common ones that, of course, you'll see are the eastern garter snake and Decay's brown snake. And then if you have your Lake Erie water snake, which you'll find mostly around the edges of the island along the shoreline. And then the species at risk that we have are the eastern fox snake and the blue racer.
Okay, great. Keeping on the snake theme, Jen, there's a question about Hibernaculum and nesting sites. So someone asked, using straw for the nesting sites, does that present a danger for introducing invasive plant species? And regarding the nesting sites, did you get any species at risk nesting in them? How did you determine the difference between eggshells if you found them, or how would you determine the difference between eggshells if you do find them in the future? And also, sorry, they also asked how you take it apart and put it together afterwards, which I think was identified in the slide, but yeah.
A lot of questions wrapped into one. Okay, so we take them apart just by basically lifting the tube of fencing up and off the straw mound. And then from there we started a tarp, and then we can kind of carefully like unpile the pile of straw and go through it as we do. So it's pretty simple. It's very messy, but it works. Whether or not we're worried about spreading invasive species from the straw, for sure, we're using straw and not hay because all the seed heads should be cut off. But you know, we're going to be keeping an eye on it and make sure that we're not causing any problems. And it did seem like the straw we were using was pretty well seedless. So we're hoping that it's going to be fine. Certainly, if you used hay, it would be a really big problem because there's all the seeds still in it. And then, what am I missing? How to tell the species apart by the eggs?
Eggshell fragments, yeah.
So eggshell fragments. So some of the species that are on Pili that Ryan was just mentioning give birth to live young. So we can kind of exclude those species as being ones that we would see nesting in these structures like with the eggs. And then blue racers in particular, the one that we're most interested in, I've actually never seen a blue racer egg, but they're supposed to have little star-shaped crimps on either side of the egg. So they have these really leathery or soft kind of elongated eggs, and they're supposed to have little star shapes on either end. So again, I've never seen one. Hopefully soon we'll get to see some, but that's how you tell them apart.
Great, thanks, Jen. So moving down the list, Anna Gret, there's a couple of questions for you. Regarding invasive earthworms, is there a chemical control option for that wouldn't affect native species that could be administered, not just particularly on the Alvar, but in general? And also, how many species of snail are found there?
Well, I'm not really aware of any chemical products against earthworms, at least not in Europe, because in Europe earthworms are very common and they're usually seen as animals that have a lot of ecosystems, or that gives a lot of ecosystem services in agriculture especially. So this is the first point. So I don't think that there is any chemical product. And if there would be a chemical product, then it's not possible to distinguish native earthworms from the European ones. But what I also, because I already responded to this question, is that on Pelee Island we didn't find any native species, at least not in our sampling areas.
And then regarding the snail species, they just asked how many other species of snails did you observe on the Alvar?
Yes, on the Alvar I saw about 16 different species, snails and slugs.
Great. Thanks, Annegret. Mark, there's a couple of questions for you. Was the research of plant response to fire restricted to vascular plants, or was it also not inclusive of non-vascular plants?
Yeah, so in our analyses that I showed, we do not include any non-vascular plants. Obviously, there are mosses that grow along the soil surface, but other than that, there weren't actually a lot of non-vascular plants in our plots.
And someone asked, out of curiosity, what was the average diversity of richness values for the plots, and what are some key native plants that we need to be focused on conserving on the island?
Yeah, so overall, we had about 17 species per meter squared. In the shallow soils, that went up to about 22 on average. In the deeper soils, it went down to about 14. Overall, we in our plots, we observed about 60 plant species. So these numbers are pretty rich. They're probably close to double what I would expect in a typical old field, say after agricultural abandonment. And the key species, well, the key species in terms of species of special concern would be obviously the hop tree, climbing rose, and blue ash. But another way to think about those alvars is that they're also a very unique combination of species that we typically don't see in other habitats in Ontario together. And so it's really that combination of species that we're just as concerned about. So not necessarily individual species, but seeing those species together in a healthy habitat, and it's trying to restore and expand those combinations of species.
Great, thanks, Mark. So moving on to some bee questions for Scott. They're asking what a representative bee species might be that would be actually doing well because of invasive plant species.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I just answered that question on the chat.
Oh, sorry.
But no, that's fine. You know, it's a funny thing because when we think of the term invasive, we think of, you know, non-native species from somewhere else. But in fact, the invasive species, for example, the sumac invading into the Alvar is a native plant, woody plant. And this sumac does support native wild bees as well, especially stem nesting bees. So I mentioned in that chat 2 species that were really overrepresented in the first 2 years were Ceratina calcarata, which is a small carpenter bee, a small stem nesting bee, which is native, as well as Bombus Grizzocolas, that brown-belted bumblebee, which is also native. So what I'm getting at here is among native bee species in Ontario, for which there are well over 400 species, some are very common, some are very rare. And so, and in many locations, we actually don't know which ones are the rare and which ones are the common ones. So the plant species that were impacting some of the sensitive Alvar plant species support some native species, and the sensitive Alvar flowers support other native bee species. And so looking at these population shifts and changes will be really interesting. But I think the main takeaway here is that there are tons of native bee species on Pelee Island.
And there's also a question about the honeybee. I don't know if you answered those about how far someone could keep a hive in order to prevent it from actually, you know, using the Alvar or impacting the bee community found on Stone Road Alvar.
Right. So, of course, honeybees are domesticated and kept in hives. And so where you place them will tell us a little bit about where you will find them, right? Honeybee workers that are out foraging for food can forage upwards of 2 kilometers to find really great resources. So there aren't too many places on the island that a honeybee couldn't reach with just a handful of colonies set out there. Point is, though, is we don't have evidence of impact on Pelee Island yet, right? There are a number of studies in places around the world, particularly in cities and in natural areas, where we have evidence of the impacts of honeybee hives on wild bees. For example, a study in 2017 by Jim Kane in Utah showed that placing a honeybee colony in a natural environment in Utah consume the food equivalent to the needs of 100,000 native wild bees per year. So you can imagine that the scaling up of honeybee colonies for hobby, for honey as a means of marketing that can very quickly overtake what resources are available in a sensitive natural area like Pelee Island. So my recommendation would be, and I say this all the time, is to keep honeybees out of natural areas. And of course, they are very critically important in our large conventional industrial agricultural system. But outside of that, we want to be mindful of the wild bee species that are present. And for those that just want to engage with a bee, there's many places to go hiking and see and experience all the colors and sizes and so forth that Pelee Island provides.
Great, thanks, Scott. There's a question about grazing, previous grazing on Alvar habitats, and I'm wondering whether Jill or Emma can speak to this. Has there been any investigation into using pasturing animals such as goats to control the large growth of bushes or trees that may not be controlled by low intensity burns? And I know Jill, you spoke a little bit about it in your presentation, but if one of you could elaborate.
Emma, you're welcome to go ahead. I would just say, as of right now, we haven't explored that option, but it's certainly something to consider in the future. We have quite a few Alvars, and now we have a little bit of a protocol of how we could assess this impact and these kinds of management techniques. So potentially that is something we could consider in the future.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to what Jill said, in some of the outreach events that we've held on the community, on the island, some community residents have definitely brought up historical grazing on some of these properties. So I do think it's, in terms of looking at the history of how these Alvars have been maintained, it's an interesting element. And is worth exploring. Of course, there are other things to consider with introducing grazers in terms of looking at the impact of it trampling on plants or other sensitive species, but it's definitely something that we could consider into the future.
And there were a couple of comments about why prescribed burns are needed, but I think those were earlier in the presentation. So hopefully Jill's wrap-up presentation kind of outlined that, even though it's a natural process, it's basically been suppressed. So that's why human intervention is needed at this point. I don't know if Emma or Jill, you had any additional comments about that. And I guess linked to that, there's a question about fire intensity and looking at variations in the response of flora and fauna to varying intensity of burns, and basically whether that would lead to a recommendation of an optimal burn condition for the species that we're monitoring.
Just a comment about the intensity, the question of intensity. It's something that we've been talking about in terms of future work. There are a lot, I mean, it's a challenge if you're implementing a prescribed burn across a large area to really have it uniform. And one of the great things about maintaining that patchiness is having that variability within the landscape in terms of creating refuges for species. But we have talked about, you know, the feasibility of doing some smaller scale intensity experiments that would allow us to kind of tease apart that question. But it's, as you can imagine, the logistics of doing it at a larger landscape scale would be very difficult. So, but just, you know, it is something that we've been talking about in terms of future work.
Okay, so we're at 1:30, so I just want to be cognizant of the time. I know there's lots of questions we didn't get to today, but if you do have any pressing questions, or you want to connect with any of the researchers or presenters today, please be sure to email us at reserves@ontarionature.org. I also forgot to mention in the beginning that we got some exciting news that all of Ontario Nature's nature reserves now count towards Canada Target 1 as protected lands in Ontario, and contributing towards the Canadian target of 17% by 2020, which has now been increased for 2025. So just wanted to share that exciting news. And yeah, and also I wanted to say, usually like this event has been a smaller in-person research event on Pelee Island with the local community. And so if there are any local community members that have any feedback or comments, we really welcome them because we do want the local community to be informed on the work that's happening on the island. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'd like to thank all the presenters, and I'll pass it back to Melina.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our webinar. Again, thank you to all the presenters for a very informative webinar, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining. We will follow up via email with a recording of the webinar. Please follow us on social media, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we'll post any upcoming events and opportunities to get involved with our nature reserves. And thank you all for joining.